I want to take a look at an incredible story of friendship, the Jonathan and David story. Now, you may already know a lot about this story, and if you do, this will be kind of a fun walk through the story. But today's portrait is really two young men who made a self-made rope of friendship connecting their lives. They tied themselves together. This is called Build the Ultimate Roommate. Okay, that's what this is. This is what this is about. This is about how do you tie your life to someone else and really build a relationship that lasts over the years. I have friends in my life, guys, that I don't see for years at a time. We get back together, and it's like we were always together. It doesn't even matter that we weren't together all that time, because we've connected on a certain level. And usually, that kind of person can read you pretty well. So I take you to this principle in chapter 18. Here's the principle. Relationships require two things: deliberate binding and maintenance. Deliberate binding and maintenance based on biblical principles. Relationships require deliberate binding and maintenance based on specific biblical principles. So right after killing Goliath, David spoke with Saul about his family. And leaving the king, he spent some time with Jonathan. And from that moment, Jonathan built a friendship with David. I want you to look at what that tied together, incredible friendship looked like. Now, I'm going to skip through parts of 18, 19, and 20 to get this, okay? So in chapter 18, I want you to look at verses 1 through 4, okay? Now, it came about when he had finished speaking to Saul that the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David. That's the word I'm using for binding. It was knit together. The soul of Jonathan was knit together with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as himself. Saul took him that day and did not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, including his sword and his bow and his belt. So David went out wherever Saul sent him and prospered, and I'll stop my reading there. I want you to notice the very first verse in chapter 18 is that Jonathan's soul connected. The beginning of the friendship is a connection. There are people that you just don't connect with in life. Have you figured that out already? They're just some kind of people that, honestly, if the two of you were lost on an island alone, just the two of you, you still probably wouldn't connect, okay? You're just not the same kind of people. But a friendship starts when you make a deliberate connection with another person. That's the word knitted in verse 1. The second thing I notice is that a friendship takes time. So in verse 2, the whole issue is time. That's when it says that Saul took him that day and did not let him return to his father's house. In other words, they spent time together. Jonathan had time with David. David had time with Jonathan. Friendship is spelled T-I-M-E. If you're going to connect to people, you have to spend time. You can't tell me they're my best friend, I never see them, never talk to them, never write to them. Then they're not your best friend. Time is one of those things that is sort of involved in the investment of the relationship. A third one, I think, is, I use the word purpose in verse 3. They made a covenant. They cut a covenant or a binding agreement based on admiration and love. That is, they decided to have a unified purpose in what they were doing. And the fourth one I see in verse 4 is the word I use for sharing. And Jonathan humbled himself. What did he do by giving his robe and his armor and his sword to David? Yeah, well, at that time, yes, he's handing off the sword, right, of the two swords. But the other thing is that he's the prince, and he's giving the princely robe to David. He's giving the princely armor to David. He's saying, I think they've had conversations about Samuel's anointing. I have to believe if they're that close, the biggest thing that ever happened in David's life is probably something that came up. And when it came up in conversation, I think Jonathan gulped hard and said, I guess I'm not going to be king, you are. So I think what he said is, God's call in your life is okay with me, even if it puts me second. It's all right with me. Friends don't get jealous of your success. They help you with your success. They are proud of you when you succeed. They laud your successes. They help you feel good about yourself. They also can cut you down to size if you're thinking too well of yourself. That's what a real friend does. But they don't cut you to hurt you, they cut you to help you. So in chapter 18, 1 through 3, I see the first 4. I want you to skip to 19 for a second. Chapter 19, verses 1 and 2, there's another element of their relationship. This one I would call protection. It says, "Now Saul told Jonathan his son and all his servants to put David to death. But Jonathan, Saul's son, greatly delighted in David. So Jonathan told David, saying, 'Saul, my father, is seeking to put you to death. Now therefore, please be on guard in the morning and stay in a secret place and hide yourself.'" This is the word I use for protection. That is, Saul's out of jealousy trying to kill David, and Jonathan's commitment to David became action. He told David to hide himself. Look, real friends look out to protect their other friend. They're not your friends if they let you walk right into it and never warn you of what's coming. You need to be careful about friends that don't take pain in your life seriously. I mean, it's all fun and games to, play tricks on one another. But when it comes down to physical pain or danger, that's not friendship anymore. There's something wrong with that. So look for people who protect you, who watch your back. Friends watch your back. The verses 3 through 5 of chapter 19, in addition to that, friends defend you. Jonathan reasoned that with his father to logically defend his friend, and he shows Saul that you're overtaken in jealousy. Look at verse 3. "I will go out and stand beside my father in the field where you are, and I will speak with my father about you. If I find out anything, then I will tell you." Then Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father and said to him, "Do not let the king sin against his servant David, since he has not sinned against you, and since his deeds have been very beneficial to you. For he took his life in his hand and struck the Philistine, and the Lord brought about great deliverance for all Israel. You saw it, you rejoiced. Why then will you sin against innocent blood by putting David to death without a cause?" Do you see? He's not only protecting David to David, he's defending David when David isn't there. David is hiding right then. And he's defending him and saying, "You don't have any cause to go against my friend. He's done nothing to warrant what you're trying to do." I could argue that David is being loyal both to Saul and to David. Because to Saul, his father, he doesn't want him to commit a death of innocent blood, to murder an innocent. And to David, he's protecting his life. Now let's go on and see it in verses 6 and 7. A word that I use the word reconciliation for verses 6 and 7. You might have something else. Reconciliation. Look at verse 6. "Saul listened to the voice of Jonathan, and Saul vowed, 'As the Lord lives, he shall not be put to death.' Then Jonathan called David, and Jonathan told him all these words. And Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as formerly." I want you to see that the reconciliation, Jonathan recognized the opportunity to bind together the broken relationship of Saul and David. So he brought them together. Real friends aren't trying to divide you from other people so that you're a better friend of theirs. Now, for some reason, a lot of people think that the way that they can make better friends is to make their friend the enemy of everyone else. That way they can have only them. That's not a friendship. That's called codependency. You need help. Okay? Don't try to divide your friends from all their other friends. Okay? The issue is reconciliation. You try to build bridges, not burn them. Now, if somebody, the exception to that is if somebody is in the life of your friend and they're destroying your friend, then probably the best thing you can do is point out that relationship is destroying you. But you don't destroy it. They do. They have to make the choices to make breaks from their own painful people in their life. There are times when you have to say, "You know what? I just can't deal with you. I really can't. I can't be a part of this." But they have to make that decision. Otherwise, you're going to try to burn the bridge and they're going to turn around and you're going to end up being the bad guy. Okay? Don't do it. You're going to end up being the bad guy. Okay, I want you to skip now to chapter 20. Still moving in this relationship. And in chapter 20, I think in the beginning of chapter 20, is the word honesty in verse 1. Honesty. Then David fled from Naot in Ramah, and came and said to Jonathan, "What have I done? What is my iniquity? What is my sin before your father that he is seeking my life?" Here's the thing. When David's on the run, he pleads with Jonathan from his own hurt and broken heart and says, "Tell me what I did." Why? Because real relationships, real friendships are honest. You need friends who are going to look right at you, and when they ask you, when you ask them the question, "What did I do?" they're going to tell you. Because the thing is, what you don't need, if you want sycophants, people that just tell you how good you are, they're wonderful. You should have plenty of them. But the fact of the matter is they're not friends. They're just there to suck up. And probably they're getting something from you. The fact of the matter is, if you want friends, you want people who are going to honestly lean in and tell you, "Look, I don't know what you're thinking, but this isn't working." By the way, that's the kind of spouse you want. Choose somebody who's strong enough to stand up to you. Don't choose somebody you can run over. If you don't go into a marriage believing that they're better than you, then you're in the wrong place. If you're standing there at the wedding going, "I cannot believe this person's actually marrying me," then you're probably marrying the right way. Because the reality is you cannot look down on the person or you're going to overpower them. And if you overpower them, you're not a friend. You're not listening to them. When you look at verse 2 and you keep on reading verses 2 and 3, you start to get to what I think is called helpfulness. Another part, develop a relationship of helpfulness in developing your friendship. And in verse 2 it says, he said to him, "Far from it, you shall not die. Behold, my father does nothing, either great or small, without disclosing it to me. So why should my father hide this thing from me? It is not so." Yet David vowed again, saying, "Your father knows well that I have found favor in your sight." And he has said, "Do not let Jonathan know this, or he will be grieved. But truly, as the Lord lives and your soul lives, there is hardly a step between me and death." Do you hear David? By the way, David is wrong here. What he's saying is wrong. God promised he would be king, which means he is not near death. He just feels near death. So out of his despair, he looks at Jonathan and he comes to the conclusion that you're just being fooled and I am really in peril. And one of the problems is when you look at your life through fear, you make terrible decisions. David is about to make some terrible decisions in the passage. But for us, sufficient to the cause is for us to say, look at how helpful Jonathan is trying to be. He's trying to undergird him. He's trying to help and say, "I know that you're not confident, but I want you to know I will protect you when you're not there." I want you to drop your eyes down to verse 13 of chapter 20 for a minute. This is the last of the ones I want to talk about in regard to relationship. In verse 13, the word selflessness comes up. "If it please my father to do you harm, may the Lord do so to Jonathan and more also. If I do not make it known to you and send you away so that you may go in safety, and may the Lord be with you as he has been with my father." Jonathan is talking to David, and Jonathan honors David and his needs above his own. Even though he was a prince, he becomes selfless and he honors him. And he makes it very clear in what he says. If this happens to you, it's going to happen to me. I'm going down with you if you're going down. There's a real sense of selflessness in this. Okay, all I gave you were 10 characteristics sprinkled through 18, 19, and 20. But those characteristics set the backdrop of a great story. A story between Jonathan and David. A story about deliberate binding and then maintaining it through troubles. Here's what I want you to know. Relationships flourish through troubled times. They really do. When troubles come into your life, the best of your relationship comes out. By the way, also the worst. So you find out who's real when trouble hits. You find out who's really in there for you and who's only in there for what you give them when trouble hits. And what I can tell you right now is, as I look at the passage, Jonathan and David knit themselves together, they bound their lives, and then they maintained them, and they did it with biblical principles. They did it with right thinking. They did it with honesty and integrity. By the way, David of the two is the weaker of the two. Jonathan has the stronger character. David has a sensitive heart, but you'll see Jonathan coming up right on the circumstances more than David is. You could also argue that David's the one who's dodging spears. So, David's the one who's feeling like his life is under threat because his life is under threat. So, maybe that plays into it as well. All right, let's move on to another aspect of this same. I want to go back to chapter 18, and this time I want to look at something not from the standpoint of the relationship of David and Jonathan, but now I just want to pick up the part of the story that's about Saul. This is following God's work with Saul now. Okay, do you understand what I just did? I took selections from 18, 19, and 20 because I think it gives you a really nice picture of David and Jonathan's relationship. But I skipped a lot of verses. And you know Rebecca, if I skip those verses, she will have nothing written down. And that will bother her. So for Rebecca, we will go back to chapter 18 and we will look at the intervening verses that have to do with Saul. Okay? You know that David killed Goliath, and you know that coming out of the story, Saul was bitten by a snake whose venom was jealousy and deceit. And his life and his power and even his decency and humanity was eventually drained from him. His family found him restless and uncaring. His kingdom started to ebb in their allegiance. But Saul resisted God and tried to find a way to fill himself apart from repentance. Lots of people do this. They will know that the way to get things peaceful is to move back to the Lord. But instead of doing that, they'll fill up their heart with something else. In a way, Jacob Marley, Scrooge's partner, from A Christmas Carol, it comes through and he's wearing a chain. Do you remember? He comes through and the chain is forged link by link to his own destruction. He's got to carry this chain. In a way, that's what Saul's doing here. He's forging a chain on his own life. The chain began with jealousy, but it ended with self-destruction. And in fact, I want you to know what the solution to a chain that starts in jealousy and ends in destruction is. There is a Saul that will cut this chain. There's only one Saul that I know of. And that is, I have to find my identity in the Lord, and that keeps me able to break the chain. If my identity is found in other people, I will allow jealousy to take me to self-destruction. If I know that my identity is formed in who God says I am, your identity is one of the most important things you can be doing this year. Who am I? Who am I really? I am a son or daughter of a great king. I belong to the Lord. He loves me. I have what I have because He cares for me. I want you to see that in verses 18, verse 8, we start to pick up the story of Saul. And let's go back to what happened in, let's say, verse 5. 18:5 says, "So David went out wherever Saul sent him and prospered." There's nothing wrong here, right? David goes out, Saul tells him what to do, he does it. Verse 5 says, "Saul set him over the men of war, and it was pleasing in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants." So in verse 5, you close the verse with a sense that David and Saul are doing well together. It happened as they were coming, when David returned from killing the Philistine, that the women came out of the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with joy, and with musical instruments. Now listen to what happened that changed Saul's heart. The women sang as they played, and they said, "Saul has slain his thousands, David tens of thousands." And Saul became very angry, for this saying displeased him. He said, "They have ascribed to David 10,000s, but to me they have ascribed thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom?" Do you see what he did? He gets jealous of a song and then blames David for the song, and jumps from a song of girls in a city to surely David's going to depose me and take away my throne. Why is Saul that insecure? What contributed to this insecurity?
He started out as insecure, and then Samuel said the one after you is going to be better than the one.
You nailed it. Both things. He started out insecure, he always was. And second, once Samuel told him that the kingdom would be torn away, every time anybody's popular, that's going to be a problem for Saul, because he's looking for how God's going to tear it away. he's going through life sure that everybody who gets any accolade is going to tear it out of his hands. He's absolutely paranoid. Okay? Now, what's interesting to me is if you go to verse 9, it says, Saul looked at David with suspicion from that day on. I want you to know something. The only thing that has to happen in your life to ruin your relationship with a dear friend is for the enemy to implant in your mind and heart jealousy over them. Love is not jealous. And if you are jealous, you do not love. The fact of the matter is, if you want to conquer jealousy in your life, start with loving the other person. Start with refusing in your own mind that you're going to be jealous and say, love is not jealous. Just repeat after me, love is not jealous, in your own heart over and over again. I work in ministry. One of the greatest temptations people put in front of people in ministry is make them jealous of other ministries. That's exactly what they do. Love is not jealous. So when people are celebrating what's happening in another ministry, even if it's another ministry, even if it's people that left here and went there, love is not jealous. And if I'm going to love that other believer, and love that other church, and love that other pastor, I can't be jealous. Why? Because jealousy kills love. That's what it does. All you have to do is be jealous of your roommate and the whole thing comes tumbling down. Just put a drop of jealousy in the well and it embitters all the water. Now, what I think is interesting is verse 9. When Saul changed his view of David, do you think David changed his view of Saul? I don't think David knows what's going on yet. I don't think he has any idea why. I think he knows that Saul's going through a bad time. I think he probably thinks he's depressed. But I don't think that David has any clue why all of a sudden Saul changes his view toward him. Now it says in verse 10, it came about on the next day that an evil spirit from God came mightily upon Saul, and he raved in the midst of the house while David was playing the harp with his hand. I want you to notice that from jealousy you go almost to madness. Allowing something, you can literally do this. Some of you may have. You can literally be so angry that somebody got the part in the play beside you that you walk around bad-mouthing them in your own bedroom by yourself. I just wish that they would drop off the face of the earth. I can't believe, how could they not see that? I was better for that than them. And jealousy can well up an anger that is unlike any other anger in your heart. You want to physically harm somebody who isn't even to blame. They don't even know you feel that way. They were trying out, you were trying out. They didn't realize they weren't supposed to try out because you were. You know how real this is? Jealousy, a lot of road rage is a form of jealousy. They get there first, and you're jealous that they got there first. And so you're like, I could just kill you, get out of my way. You know, it's like, and you see people acting like this on the road. Jealousy isn't loving. Bottom line, I think when you look at it, it says that David was playing the harp with his hand, as usual, and a spear was in Saul's hand, as usual. Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David escaped from his presence, not once, but twice. I want you to see something. Here are the chains. Let's put the chains together. Starts with, on one end, jealousy. Now, look at the chain link. Link number 1, very angry in verse 8. And what's interesting is, it's literally the words really burned, which denote a feeling of deep intensity, heat. I feel burned. Then it's, in verse 8, displeased. It's actually the words, ra'ayin is actually the term, gave him an evil eye or turned an evil eye toward him. You start seeing, when it says displeased in the text, what it literally means is that Saul began to put intentions in David's heart. Have you ever done that? Have you ever put intentions in somebody else's heart in your own mind? When it says he was displeased with him, it literally means he gave him an evil eye. That is, he began to read what David was doing and think he understood the motivations. David didn't know anything about it. Back in verse 8, David's still just la, 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 being David. In the meantime, Saul's looking at him going, he's doing this to get my kingdom. David's just doing this because that's what he's doing. I want you to know that when you're innocent, you don't see what the other party sees. You're just walking through it. You have no idea. So in verse 10, there's a third link. So I have the first link is very angry. The second link is displeased or has an evil eye. By the way, this is a heart deception. I want you to see in the middle of verse 8, it says, this displeased him. They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and by the end of the passage, he's saying, David's going to kill me and get my kingdom. He has a heart deception. Remember I told you earlier in the year that the only way you can conquer the sin is to get to the lie. Pull the lie out and you can deal with the sin. Otherwise, the sin is a symptom of a lie you believe. I want you to notice that in verse 11, Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. You know what that is? I use the words extreme reaction. He counters normal behavior, normal character. This is an extreme reaction, like when you toss somebody overboard, like Jonah, into the deep. The word hurled, vayetul, is actually thrown with force or yanked out. Now, the interesting thing is if you keep reading, you get to verse 12, it says, Saul was afraid of David. Look at that. The next chain in the link that goes from jealousy to destruction is an irrational fear that confuses offensive behavior with defensiveness. Here's the thing. It says, Saul was afraid of David, for the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. Can we all just remember that Saul is the tosser of the spear? David is the tossee. Generally, the person throwing the spear is not the person who's fearful. If the spear's coming toward me, I'm the one who's afraid. This is totally backwards. He's throwing spears at him, wearing the crown, and he's afraid of the kid who's ducking the spears who doesn't have a crown. How ludicrous is this? The point of the story is that when you continue that chain link from jealousy, you go from an extreme reaction to irrational fear, and you start making your decisions based on an irrational fear. The second half of verse 12 is that God departed from Saul. There was a disruption of the flow of God's power and a disruption of the flow of God's blessing. And when you get down to 13, 14, 15, in 15 in particular, it says, when Saul saw that he was prospering greatly, he dreaded him. Now there's an attempt to gain control by adding some strings to his life. What does he do? Verse 17, Saul said to David, here is my older daughter Merab, I will give her to you as wife. Only be a valiant man for me and fight the Lord's battles. For Saul thought, my hand shall not be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him. I would like to see him dead, so let me throw him into a battle where I think he's going to die. I'll promise him something great like the hand of my daughter, but really I'm hoping that the Philistines kill him so that nobody can blame me. He will have died in battle and my problem goes away. The problem is, Saul is trying to gain control of the situation. What he's trying to do is say, all right, David's rising in popularity. It looks like David is going to be king. I'm wondering if someone whispered into Saul's ear that Samuel had dropped by to anoint David years before. I'm wondering if somehow it doesn't become known to Saul that doesn't add to his insecurity. I don't know. But I can tell you that he is walking around moving from jealousy to a full out-and-out self-destruction. What I think is interesting is that if I keep reading, I find that back in verse 24, the servants of Saul reported to him according to the words which David spoke. Verse 25, Saul then said, thus you shall say to David, the king does not desire any dowry except for 100 foreskins of the Philistines to take vengeance on the king's enemies. What's interesting is, if you really look at this, what he's doing is he's setting up David. He's saying that it says, now Saul planned to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. This is Plan to make David fall is literally plan ways to collapse the other. He's trying to find a way to get rid of the guy, but not take the responsibility. I think one of the things that ends up in the story, you know how the story goes on. It says, when his servants, verse 26, told David these words, it pleased David to become the king's son-in-law. Before the day had expired, David rose up, went. He and his men struck down 200 men of the Philistines and brought him their foreskins and gave them in full number to the king that he might become the king's son-in-law. So Saul gave him Michal, for his daughter, for a wife. When Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him, then Saul was even more afraid of David. Thus Saul was David's enemy continually. What that says in verse 29 is he becomes unendingly hostile to David. Look what's happening now. Started with jealousy, ended with an unending continual hostility that Saul couldn't shake. In the beginning, he could shake it off, but by now he's stuck in it. He's forged a chain that he can't get out of. Jealousy begins with a sense of insecurity about ourselves, but it really isn't about the other guy. You have to understand, what's going on in Saul's heart isn't about David, it's about Saul. If you're jealous of somebody, it's not their fault. It's not even about them. It could be them or somebody else. Your problem is with you, not with them. Jealous and bitter people try to desperately control the people who are around them. That's what they try to do. Jealous and bitter people try to test the loyalties of others. When you look at this story, you're going to find that he's going to test David, he's going to test Jonathan, he's going to test Michal. Saul is all about putting tests in, even in his own family, because he's jealous. Jealous and bitter people tend to think they can read the hearts of other people. One of the biggest mistakes you'll see is in verse 8 here. In 18:8, the biggest mistake is you can't read the motivations and heart of other people. You can't. You can think you know what they're doing, but you don't know what they're doing. And one of the problems here is that jealous people think they can read other people's hearts. And it's really easy. By the way, you see this in couples, don't you? She's like, oh, he's just doing that to show off to her. You don't know why he's doing what he's doing. Now, sometimes people are incredibly obvious, but for the most part, you can't read what's in somebody else's mind. Jealous and bitter people see others through the jaded eyes that don't behold the truth. I think jealous and bitter people walk in that way, and it brings a dark cloud over their countenance. That's why I think in 18:10, he's just getting worse and worse. The more jealous he gets, the worse he gets. It just brings this cloud over him. I think the thing is that when you act in jealousy, it ends up helping you to be dishonest in your dealings with people. I want you to drop your eyes down to some verses in 17 through 19. 18, 17 through 19. I know I'm going back, but I just want you to see this. In verse 17, then Saul said to David, here's my older daughter Merab. I will give her to you as wife. Only be a valiant man for me and fight the Lord's battles. For Saul thought, my hand shall not be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him. But David said to Saul, who am I and what is my life or my father's family in Israel that I should become the king's son-in-law? So it came about at that time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, she was given to Adriel, the Meholathite, for a wife. In other words, you're going to become dishonest in your dealings with people when you act out of jealousy. You no longer see fair as fair. You walk around with all's fair in love and war, which is your way of saying I'm exempt from morality. I can do whatever I want. And I think one of the things it's going to do is it's going to drive you to use other people to try and end your pain, but your pain won't end because you're jealous, and that's your problem. Ultimately, the issue isn't about everyone else. It's about you. So let's just take 18 and say the bulk of chapter 18 is really a study in jealousy. Somewhere near chapter 18, you need to write down, this is a study in what jealousy looks like and what it does. Most of the time, chapter 18 is a chapter for me, not for other people. It's for me to say, are you responding honestly, or are you jealous of what they have? I think, do you think less of me because I told you that? Here's the thing, I think it's really easy for any of us to get jealous of somebody else. There's an old story that goes back to the Byzantine period of Satan gathers together all the demons, and he's trying to get the bishop of Carthage to sin. And the demons come together and they're explaining all the reasons, the ways they're going to make him sin. And one says, oh, I'm going to dangle in front of him a beautiful young maiden. And Satan says, that's not going to work. He's not going to fall for lust. That's not what's going to happen. And another demon comes in and says, I'm going to divide his congregation and make trouble in his congregation. And Satan goes, that's not going to work. He's not going to fall for just the divisions among people. The third demon comes in and says, I know exactly what I'm going to do. I'm just going to send him a letter that the other guy he graduated with, he got a better position. And what ended up happening is the Bishop of Carthage gets jealous. The point is, one of the great tools of the enemy in our lives is jealousy. I work hard to celebrate what God is doing in other people around me. And I do it deliberately because I know myself. I know that I'm not competitive by nature, but would become competitive if I allowed it to happen. I do compete all the time, but I compete with me. So let me tell you exactly what you do. If you're a competitive person, then take a Saturday morning. Does everybody have that Saturday morning in mind where they just don't really want to accomplish anything? I mean, they'd love to accomplish things if they would do themselves. If you could do this with your nose and the sweeping would happen by itself while you lie on the couch, that would be fine. But you don't have a lot of energy because it's a Saturday, and why should you? If you want to do something that's really going to help you with competitive energy, then outline for yourself, what do I want to become? What do I want it to be? And then run against yourself. I can do better than that. I can do it faster than that. Last time I did one room, I cleaned one room in 4 hours. This time I can clean 2 rooms just as clean as that one room, and I can do it in the same 4 hours. And then fight yourself. Here's what happens. Your disciplines will increase and your competitive energy will go against something that doesn't harm other people but helps you. Use the energy for something. Let me ask you something. Did you ever use anger to do chores? Am I the only person who knows this? Do you know this one? Where you just go, I am so mad. I will wash these dishes like they have never been washed. That's good. It's a way of putting and channeling something into something that's productive. And that's not going to harm you. It's going to help you.